I don't know if you guys don't know, but I don't care. Like, I don't care, and I think that's with the good stuff like our league does to help with that. If they really do anything, you know, you can put out statements as much as you want, but at the end of the day, you're in an entertainment business. That's when mental toughness comes in. If you're gonna live by praise, you're gonna die by the hate, and so I think that's on the individual person to have mental toughness. Some people can deal with it, some people can't, and I think you can see the.
You're about to see something the WNBA tried desperately to keep hidden. Not some conspiracy. Not some backstage drama manufactured for ratings. This is the moment when one of the most promising athletes of her generation finally broke silence about what it actually feels like to be hunted by a system designed to chew you up and spit you out. For 3 years we've watched this unfold in real time, and every time a player tried to speak about it, the league's PR machine kicked into overdrive. They edited press conferences. They controlled the narrative. They told everyone to stay quiet and handle it with grace. But something changed. One player looked directly into the camera and said what everyone was thinking but too afraid to say out loud. And when she did, everything people thought they knew about professional women's basketball completely shattered. This isn't about one bad call. This isn't about social media drama. This is about what happens when an entire organization fails to protect its most valuable asset while the world watches. The story that follows will show you exactly
toxicity, racism, homophobia, straight out like nonsense, hate nonsense. And it is absolutely unacceptable. Most of this coming from the online community, most of this, you know, in my heart of hearts, I believe not coming from WNBA fans, Indiana Fever fans. You know, I believe that this is people who are using our league, using our players to
see how it happened, why nobody stopped it, and what it reveals about the future of women's sports in America. To understand what really went down, you have to know where this started. 3 years ago, Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA as the franchise's biggest hope, a generational talent, with the potential to reshape how the world viewed women's basketball. The Indiana Fever organization bet everything on her. Media companies built entire broadcast schedules around her. Sponsors signed massive deals. Fans from around the world tuned in. But something was happening beneath the surface that nobody wanted to talk about. Every single game, she was getting hit in ways that weren't being called. Not accidentally, deliberately. Other players were noticing it. Coaches were noticing it. The league was noticing it. And nothing was changing. Meanwhile, online something darker was brewing. It wasn't basketball fans criticizing her game. It was something uglier. Coordinated harassment. Racial and homophobic attacks. Hate speech designed to break her mentally.
Straightforward. It's kind of been a discussion for like 3 years now, and I think we really need to do a better job protecting the people in this league. And, you know, obviously I've been involved in a few of those plays, but there's been plenty others across the league that, you know, haven't got called, you know, go back and post game or whatever it is, teams submit clips, nothing really changes. So I think overall the league just has to do better, and we have to invest in those areas. The technology can get better. We can treat the referees a little bit better, pay them like they're full-time employees. I think things like that, and you know, I think a lot has obviously come after that. And as I've stood up here and said before, like the harassment, the hate, none of that is okay. That goes for the opposing team we play. That goes for my teammates. That goes for my coaches. You know, there should never be a question of character. Like I've always stood up here and said that, and that's truly what I believe. That's how I was raised. So, you know, none of that is okay.
The organization knew about it. They made statements. They condemned it publicly. But behind closed doors, the message was different. Handle it. Stay mentally tough. Don't complain. This is the business we're in. But when you push a player this talented, this determined into a corner for long enough, something has to give. And that's exactly what happened next. Let's start with what actually triggered everything. It wasn't one single moment. It was an accumulation of failures so obvious that even casual basketball fans couldn't ignore it anymore. The specific play everyone's talking about happened on a Wednesday night. Caitlin Clark was driving toward the
what Caitlin Clark had to say, but we got people like Stephen A. Smith, Shanae Agumake speaking out against Caitlin Clark. We got the Kelsey Plum thing. So much stuff to talk about, man. I'm going to try to get through all the content and catch up today. So bear with me, guys, and just please watch the videos if you can.
You did what? Well, it's not like I was on vacation. I was rotting in my bed. I feel better. Just kind of waiting for my energy and this headache to kind of go away a little bit. But I'm here, and so that's great.
What's it like to see yourself become a meme in real time to the extent that you have this last week?
Yeah, so goofy. Like,
What the helly?
so goofy. Like,
Basket when she got absolutely hammered by a defender. Not a normal basketball contact. A full-force collision that should have been an automatic flagrant foul. The refs didn't call it. The broadcast showed the replay. Everyone watching at home saw it. Social media exploded. But here's where it gets revealing. This wasn't some rare occurrence. This was the third, fourth, fifth time in a single week that a similarly uncalled play had happened. And the pattern was impossible to deny once you started looking for it. Other players were getting protected. Other players were getting the benefit of the doubt on close calls. But Caitlin Clark? She was getting a completely different rule set. Tougher. Meaner. Like the referees had collectively decided that part of her initiation into professional basketball meant letting her get beaten up without consequences. The league office knew about it. You could tell because of how they responded. Instead of acknowledging the refereeing problem, they started controlling the conversation. Edited press.
everyone, it's getting worldwide views now, and so it's just been kind of fun to see. But honestly, I've been like dying in my bed, so I haven't really seen. My mom's keeping me up to date on everything, but it's funny, it's cool. I didn't even mean for it to blow up like that, but you know, the internet does what the internet does.
Do you have a favorite one of the ones you have?
Yeah, Statue of Liberty, dude, that is my favorite one. I feel like we need to change that.
Did you see the one with the White House posted with the president in it? And do you have any thoughts on it?
You know, I think everyone around the world is posting it. Every company has done it. They're just the ones that also get on board, and so I don't really think twice about it. I think they're just another group who is posting about it.
I think our fans voted a lot of players in the top 40, which just shows how much they care.
Oh, no.
But I'm proud of them.
Oh, no. Don't tell me that they edit the damn... Y'all they edit the thing, man. Bro, the Indiana Fever is editing their press conferences. They're definitely cutting out what these players are saying. We watching Tony East, bruh. We watching Tony East, bruh. They edited it.
Dying in my bed, so I haven't really seen. My mom's keeping me up to date on everything, but
Conferences. Carefully worded statements about supporting all players. But nobody was addressing the actual issue. Why weren't the calls being made? Why was one player being treated differently? What changed? That's when something fascinating happened. Players started talking to each other in ways they weren't supposed to. Behind closed doors at team facilities and group chats. They weren't blaming Caitlin Clark for struggling. They were blaming the system for failing her. And they were getting angry about it. Sophie Cunningham, a veteran player with nothing left to prove, became the voice of that frustration. She'd been in the league long enough to know how things worked. She'd seen talented players come and go. She understood the politics. But even she couldn't stay silent watching this unfold. The emotional toll was visible. You could see it in Caitlin's body language on the court. The constant looking back at referees. The hesitation on drives. The way her confidence was slowly being chipped away by an environment that wasn't protecting her. Then came the press conference that changed everything. Caitlin stood up and did what she was supposed to do. She talked about mental toughness. She talked about handling criticism. She condemned the online harassment. She said the coaching staff had her back. But if you listen carefully, really listen to what she was actually saying, the subtext was devastating. She was describing the exact psychological experience of being in an environment where you have to convince yourself that people care about you because the evidence says otherwise. She was talking about the necessity of mental toughness not as inspiration but as survival. That's when people started noticing something weird. The Indiana Fever's official social media channels began editing clips of the press conference. Specific parts were being cut out. Specific criticisms of the league were disappearing from their posted versions. This wasn't subtle. Multiple fans noticed it. Video editors compared the original broadcasts to the posted clips. Entire sections about the refereeing issues were gone. Entire passages about needing better protection were removed. The organization was literally erasing the most important parts of what their star player was saying. And that's when the real anger started building. Not among casual fans. Among the people closest to the situation. The locker room. The coaching staff knew what was happening. The front office knew what was happening. The league knew what was happening. But the public narrative was being controlled so carefully that people on the outside didn't realize the severity of what was going on. Players like Sophie Cunningham watched this and realized something critical. The system was designed to protect itself, not the players. The edited press conferences. The controlled statements. The PR teams on standby. All of it was infrastructure built to manage problems, not solve them. And Caitlin Clark was being sacrificed to that machine. She was supposed to be the future of women's basketball. She was supposed to be the player that elevated everyone. But instead, she was being isolated, unsupported in the ways that mattered, and slowly broken down by a combination of physical punishment on the court and psychological pressure off it. That's the actual breaking point. Not one play, not one controversy, but the moment when it became undeniable that the entire system was failing, and the people inside it finally couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine. To understand how deep this goes, you have to understand how refereeing actually works in the WNBA. And this is where things get really revealing. The league has officiating standards, rules written down, video reviews, training protocols, all of it supposedly designed to make the game fair and consistent. But there's a massive gap between what the rule book says and what actually happens on the court. And that gap is where players like Caitlin Clark get destroyed. Here's the reality that nobody wants to admit. Refereeing in professional basketball is subjective. Two refs can watch the same contact and interpret it completely differently. One sees a normal basketball play. One sees a foul. One sees a flagrant. The discretion is built into the job. But that discretion has consequences. When a young player enters the league, especially a young player who's going to revolutionize the sport and take minutes away from established veterans, the refs often let defenders get away with more. It's not written down anywhere. It's not official league policy, but it's understood. It's how the game works. It's hazing. It's initiation. It's the old guard protecting itself. The problem with Caitlin Clark is that she's not just good. She's transcendent. She's the kind of player that changes how a sport is played. And there are people in the league, players, coaches, teams who don't want that change to happen too quickly. So they test the boundaries. They see what they can get away with. And when the refs don't call it, they keep pushing. The technology exists to fix this. Video review systems. AI-powered officiating analysis. Statistical tracking that could identify patterns of inconsistent calls across players and across the season. But here's what's fascinating. The league invests in some areas but not others. They have money for broadcast quality. They have money for marketing. But refereeing upgrades? That's slower. That's more complicated. That involves changing how the game is fundamentally officiated. And changing that means admitting that the current system is broken. So instead, the league throws resources at communication. They talk about it. They acknowledge it in statements. But the actual infrastructure for fixing it doesn't get the priority. That's not incompetence. That's choice. What makes this worse is how the league responds when players call it out. Instead of taking responsibility, they deflect. They talk about mental toughness. They talk about handling criticism. They make vague statements about working on officiating standards. But they don't make concrete changes. They don't acknowledge that one player is being treated differently. They don't say, "Yes, we see the pattern and here's what we're doing about it." Instead, they manage the narrative. They control what gets said in press conferences. They work with media to frame it as normal growing pains rather than systemic failure. And that's where the real damage happens. Because here's what that does to a player psychologically. When you're being hit constantly and the refs aren't calling it, you start questioning reality. Am I being too sensitive? Is this normal contact? Should I toughen up? Should I adjust my game? The organization reinforces that by talking about mental toughness, by saying that the harassment online is something you have to deal with, by implying that if you're struggling, it's because you're not mentally strong enough. They take a systemic problem and reframe it as an individual weakness. And that's psychological manipulation on a professional level. The refereeing failures are compounded by how inconsistent the league is about everything else. They'll have strict dress codes. They'll penalize players for minor violations. They'll control what players can say publicly. But when it comes to protecting players from physical harm and harassment, suddenly everyone's saying, that's just part of the game. That's not a double standard. That's a priority system. The league cares more about controlling the image of the sport than protecting the people playing it. What's especially revealing is how other players experience this differently. Veterans who've been in the league longer seem to get more calls. Players who haven't threatened the status quo get more protection. But players like Caitlin Clark-Young, talented, revolutionary, bringing new fans and new money, they get tested. They get beaten up. They get told it's normal. And when they speak about it, the league's response is to minimize and manage rather than fix. This is the system. Not one bad referee. Not one biased coach. But an entire infrastructure built on maintaining the current power structure while appearing to be meritocratic. The moment you start noticing this pattern, you can't stop seeing it. Every game becomes evidence. Every uncalled foul becomes proof. And when you're inside the locker room, when you're seeing it happen to your teammate every single night, staying silent stops being an option. Now let's talk about the part that rarely gets discussed honestly. The online harassment. Not the normal sports debate. Not fans disagreeing about plays or statistics. The actual coordinated attacks. The racial slurs. The homophobic comments. The death threats. This is where things get disturbing. And it's also where the league's failures become undeniable. When Caitlin Clark entered the WNBA, she brought something the league had never had at this scale. A massive, young, diverse fanbase. Millions of people suddenly tuning in who'd never watched women's basketball before. That's supposed to be a good thing. New money. New attention. New growth. But it also attracted something else. People from outside the basketball community. People who weren't WNBA fans. People who had different agendas. The harassment targeting Caitlin Clark didn't come primarily from basketball communities. The league confirmed this. It came from people using the WNBA as a platform for something else. Racial attacks. Homophobic attacks. Political messaging. Misogyny. All of it targeted at one player. And here's the critical part. Most WNBA fans were horrified by it. The actual basketball community was condemning it. But the noise was so loud that it dominated the conversation. The league's response was to make statements, to condemn the behavior, to talk about doing better. But statements don't stop attacks. Rules don't stop harassment. What stops it is investigation, accountability, and consequences. Social media platforms banning users, identifying organized attack groups, working with law enforcement on serious threats. That requires resources and commitment. What the league did instead was ask players to be mentally tough about it, to handle it, to not let it affect them. In other words, they externalized the problem, made it the player's responsibility to manage the toxicity being directed at her rather than the league's responsibility to prevent it. This creates an impossible situation for any player. You're supposed to perform at an elite level while being subjected to constant harassment. You're supposed to stay focused while people online are saying things designed specifically to break you mentally. You're supposed to represent the league while the league isn't protecting you from the abuse. And when you speak about how difficult this is, the response is that you're not mentally tough enough. That's not motivation. That's gaslighting. What makes this worse is how selective the league was about acknowledging problems. When coaches made controversial statements, the league was quick to respond. When players violated dress codes, there were immediate consequences. But when fans were organizing harassment campaigns, that was treated as inevitable. That was treated as something players had to learn to handle. The message was clear. We care more about controlling the image of the sport than protecting the players from abuse. The timeline is revealing because it shows escalation. Early in Caitlin's career, the attacks were sporadic. But as she got more attention, as she became more central to the WNBA's growth, the attacks became more organized, more vicious, more targeted. And with each attack, the league's response was the same. Statements, condemnations, calls for fans to be better. But no structural changes. No investigation into coordinated harassment groups. No real consequence for the worst offenders. Just more pressure on Caitlin to handle it with grace. There's also something else happening here that's worth examining. Some of the criticism directed at Caitlin Clark wasn't harassment. It was legitimate sports debate. Some people thought her game didn't translate to the professional level. Some people thought other players were being overshadowed. Some people had different opinions about how she should have been playing. That's normal. That's part of professional sports. But the league didn't distinguish between that legitimate criticism and the actual harassment. They lumped it all together. And when players or fans tried to separate the two, tried to say, we can criticize her game without the racial slurs and death threats, that distinction got lost in the narrative management. This is crucial because it allowed the league to dismiss concerns about the harassment. They could point to the legitimate criticism and say, see, people are just being critical. This is normal. But mixing legitimate debate with coordinated hate campaigns is a tactic. It muddies the waters. It makes it easier for the league to avoid responsibility. It makes it easier for social media platforms to do nothing. And it makes the player's situation worse because now she can't distinguish between people who genuinely disagree with her basketball abilities and people who are attacking her for who she is. By the end, the harassment had taken a real psychological toll. Not just on Caitlin Clark but on her teammates, on the organization, on the league's reputation. And the response was still the same. More statements. More talk about mental toughness. More pressure on the player rather than pressure on the people attacking her. That's the real story of the toxicity timeline. Not that it happened, but how the league chose to respond when it did. This is where things get genuinely disturbing. Because the editing of press conference footage wasn't accidental. It wasn't a technical glitch. It was deliberate editorial decisions made by an organization trying to control a narrative that was spiraling out of their control. Here's what happened. Caitlin Clark gave a press conference where she spoke about the refereeing issues, the need for better protection, and the toll that the environment was taking on her. It was a vulnerable moment. She wasn't attacking anyone directly. She wasn't making wild accusations. She was simply describing her experience and calling for systemic improvements. The league heard that and realized something critical. If fans watched that entire press conference without editing, the narrative would shift. People would understand what was actually happening. They would stop seeing it as one player struggling to adjust and start seeing it as a system failing a player. So they edited it. The Indiana Fever's official channels posted a version that removed the most damaging parts. The criticisms of the refereeing. The descriptions of insufficient protection. The most honest moments where Caitlin explained what she was actually experiencing. What remained was the parts where she talked about mental toughness and handling criticism. The parts that fit the narrative that the league preferred. A narrative where the problem was with the player, not with the system. The moment fans and journalists started comparing the original broadcast to the posted version, it became obvious what was happening. And this isn't just about one press conference. This is about a pattern of control. This is about an organization that understood something critical. If they allowed the actual story to get out, if they allowed players and coaches to speak freely about what was really happening, the carefully constructed image of the league would collapse. So they managed. They controlled. They edited. They worked with media partners to frame stories in certain ways. They pressured players to give certain kinds of statements. They built an infrastructure of narrative control that was actually more sophisticated than anything designed to actually fix the problems. What makes this revealing is what it says about institutional priorities. The resources that went into editing footage, crafting statements, managing media relationships, those same resources could have gone into actually protecting players, into improving refereeing standards, into investigating and stopping harassment, into creating an environment where young players didn't have to choose between reporting problems and being seen as not mentally tough. But that wasn't the choice the organization made. They chose image management over player protection. The edited footage also reveals something about how the coaching staff was managing the situation internally. When you edit out Caitlin's criticisms from official channels, you're sending a message to everyone in the organization. You're saying that these criticisms are embarrassing. They're problems to be hidden. They're not legitimate concerns to be addressed. That message filters down. It affects how the coaching staff treats the player. It affects how teammates respond. It creates an environment where the actual issues can't be discussed openly, Because the organization has already decided that they need to be hidden. This is psychological manipulation on an organizational level. You're telling a player that her legitimate concerns aren't worth addressing. You're telling her that her experience doesn't matter as much as the image of the league. You're telling her that speaking about problems is a mistake because it will be reframed and edited and managed away. That destroys trust. That isolates the player. That makes the psychological toll even worse because now she's dealing not just with the original problems, but with the knowledge that her own organization isn't supporting her openly. What's particularly revealing is how the league responded when the editing was noticed. They didn't say, "We made mistakes. We should have let her speak freely." They didn't acknowledge that managing the narrative is different from fixing problems. They just moved on. They acted like it was a minor issue, like slightly editing a press conference was a normal part of communication strategy, which, in their world, it probably is. But that's exactly the problem. The normalization of control. The assumption that managing perception is more important than addressing reality. The edited footage also shows what Sophie Cunningham and other players were reacting to. They were watching their organization minimize their teammates' actual experience. They were watching legitimate concerns get erased from official records. They were watching the institution protect itself rather than protect its players. And that's what broke the code of silence. That's what made Sophie go on that live broadcast and say what everyone was thinking. Because at that point, staying silent meant being complicit in the erasure. It meant accepting that image management was more important than protecting a teammate. This is the real scandal. Not some hidden conspiracy, but the everyday decisions made by institutions to manage perception rather than address reality. The editing of footage. The careful wording of statements. The pressure on players to say certain things and not say others. All of it designed to maintain control. All of it failing to actually address what needed to be addressed. And all of it creating an environment toxic enough that even veteran players couldn't stay silent anymore. Understanding why Sophie Cunningham and other veterans finally broke silence requires understanding the unwritten code that exists in professional sports locker rooms. There's a loyalty hierarchy. You protect your teammates. You don't air conflicts publicly. You handle things internally. You present a united front to the outside world. That code is sacred. It's how teams function. It's how trust is maintained. But when an entire organization begins to fail a player in fundamental ways, and especially when that failure is being hidden and minimized by the institution itself, that code eventually breaks. Sophie Cunningham isn't some rookie who doesn't understand how the league works. She's a veteran. She knows the politics. She understands that speaking out carries consequences. There are unspoken ramifications for being a problem player. For being someone who doesn't follow the narrative. For being vocal about institutional failures. Smart players learn early on to keep quiet about these things. To protect themselves. To not make enemies in the front office. Cunningham knew all of this. And she spoke anyway. That tells you something about how bad things had gotten. What changed is that she reached a point where staying silent meant something worse. It meant accepting that her teammate was being sacrificed. It meant being complicit in the erasure of legitimate concerns. It meant watching an organization prioritize image management over player protection and pretending that was acceptable. And for Cunningham, that crossed a line. She'd been in the league long enough to understand that Caitlin Clark represented something different for women's basketball. Not just as a player but as a symbol of growth and change. The league had invested everything in that narrative. Fans had invested emotionally in it. And now that same league was quietly breaking down the player at the center of that narrative while telling her it was her responsibility to handle it. The locker room dynamics are revealing here. When one player is being treated this way and everyone knows it but nobody says anything publicly, it creates a specific kind of psychological environment. Everyone's pretending. Everyone's acting like everything is fine. Everyone's performing the role of a united team, while watching a teammate get slowly isolated and broken down. That's not healthy. That's not sustainable. And for players like Cunningham who have experience and perspective, it becomes unbearable. What's also important is understanding what Cunningham was protecting by speaking out. She wasn't trying to destroy the league or even the organization. She was trying to protect the future of women's basketball itself. Because if this was allowed to continue, if talented players could be treated this way without anyone speaking up, then what message does that send to young girls thinking about entering professional basketball? What does it say about the environment they'd be entering? Cunningham understood that staying silent meant accepting that this would happen again, that the next generational talent would go through the same thing, and that the league would use the same playbook to manage the narrative and hide the problems. There's also a generational element here. Cunningham is at a different point in her career than Caitlin Clark. She doesn't have as much to lose. She's not trying to prove herself anymore. She doesn't need to worry about endorsements or future contracts in the same way. That gives her freedom. Freedom to speak honestly. Freedom to not be managed by the narrative. Freedom to say what everyone in the locker room was thinking but afraid to say. That's why it's often the veterans who break first. They have less to lose and more perspective. The loyalty fracture also reveals the hypocrisy of the institution. The league talks constantly about player welfare, about mental health, about supporting each other. But when players actually try to support each other by speaking about institutional failures, the league frames it as disloyalty, as being a problem, as not being a team player. That's gaslighting on an organizational level. The league wants loyalty that only flows upward. That protects the institution. That doesn't question the system. But that's not loyalty. That's compliance. What Cunningham did was genuine loyalty. She was loyal to her teammate. Loyal to the future of women's basketball. Loyal to the idea that players should be protected rather than managed. And that meant being disloyal to the institution's preference for silence and narrative control. That's a choice that comes with consequences. There will be fallout. There will be people in the league who resent her for speaking out. There might be professional consequences down the line. But Cunningham clearly decided that protecting her teammate and speaking the truth was worth those costs. The fracture also sends a message to other players. It shows that speaking out is possible, that there are consequences, but that staying silent also has consequences to your conscience, to your sense of integrity, to your ability to live with the choices you're making. For Cunningham and others who followed her lead, the cost of speaking out became less than the cost of staying silent. That's when institutional power loses its grip. That's when change becomes possible. Not because the institution decides to change, but because people inside it decide that they can't be part of the machine anymore. The question now is what happens next. Because this moment where players publicly broke silence, where editing practices were exposed, where the gap between the league's public statements and actual practices became undeniable, this moment is an inflection point. The league can't just move on. The story has too much visibility. The institutional failures are too obvious. The question is whether this becomes the moment where real change happens, or whether this becomes another scandal that gets managed, minimized, and eventually forgotten. History suggests that institutions don't change willingly. They change when they have to, when the pressure is too great to ignore, when the alternative to change is worse than the discomfort of changing. The WNBA is at that point, but just barely. The league has significant leverage to manage this situation. They control the narrative channels. They have media relationships. They have the power to decide which stories get covered and which get buried. They can frame this as growing pains, as normal conflicts in a young league, as the price of rapid expansion. And a lot of people will accept that framing because it's comfortable, because it doesn't require difficult conversations about systemic failures. But something has shifted. The players have spoken, not just individually but collectively. The sentiment in locker rooms around the league has shifted. Veteran players who understood the code of silence have decided that code is no longer acceptable. That's harder to control than individual statements. That's harder to manage through PR teams and narrative control. When players across the league are having conversations about this, when it's being discussed in team facilities and group chats, when it's affecting how players feel about their organization and their league, that's when things can actually change. The broadcast companies also have a role here. They had footage of everything. They saw the edited press conferences. They saw what was being cut out and what was being kept. They could have reported on that more directly. They could have chosen to cover the story of institutional failures rather than just running with the official narrative. Some outlets did. Some journalists did important work here. But others went along with the managed narrative. That affects what people know about what actually happened. It affects whether accountability is possible. Looking forward, the WNBA has specific choices to make. They need to actually address refereeing inconsistencies, not with statements, with changes to training, evaluation, and accountability mechanisms for officials. They need to create clearer structures for investigating and responding to harassment, both from players and from fans. They need to stop using mental health language as a way to externalize problems that are actually structural. They need to commit to transparency. That means not editing press conferences. That means letting players speak freely. That means accepting that criticism of the league is sometimes legitimate and responding to it seriously rather than just managing the narrative. But here's what's likely to actually happen. The league will make some changes. They'll invest a bit more in refereeing technology. They'll have conferences about player safety. They'll make statements about zero tolerance for harassment. They'll frame it as responding to the concerns that were raised. And then they'll try to move forward with the same basic system in place. That's what institutions typically do. They make surface-level changes that make it look like they're responding, while the underlying structures remain the same. The question for players going forward is whether they'll accept that, whether they'll be satisfied with symbolic gestures, or whether this moment of solidarity that was created will continue to create pressure for actual systemic change. That depends on players continuing to speak out, on them not accepting the return to normal once the immediate crisis passes, on them understanding that this isn't just about Caitlin Clark anymore. It's about what women's professional sports looks like going forward. There's also a broader lesson here for women's sports generally. This isn't unique to basketball. This is a pattern that repeats across different sports. Talented female athletes get into environments that aren't equipped to protect them. They get told to be mentally tough. The institutions frame everything as individual strength rather than institutional responsibility. And those athletes are often sacrificed at the altar of the institution's preference for maintaining control. This moment, where one player's experience prompted broader conversation about these patterns, could be a turning point. If it creates a template for how to challenge these systems, if it shows that speaking out is possible and that collective support matters, if it proves that the code of silence can be broken when the stakes are high enough. For Caitlin Clark specifically, what comes next is less clear. The damage that's been done won't be undone by statements or policy changes. The psychological toll of the experience will stay with her. The question is whether she'll be able to move forward in an environment that's actually been transformed, or whether she'll continue in a league that's mostly managing the appearance of change while fundamentally staying the same. That affects her career. It affects her legacy. And it affects whether she stays or whether she decides that the cost of playing in this environment is too high, regardless of how talented she is. The broader lesson is clear though. Systems don't protect themselves by being right. They protect themselves by controlling the narrative. But when enough people inside those systems refuse to be controlled, when they decide that truth is more important than institutional loyalty, that's when change becomes possible. This moment showed that. The question now is what comes next.